What happens when a millionaire CEO walks into his own coffee shop in disguise, and two baristas unknowingly confess something that shakes him to his core. Harlan Vance had built his coffee chain from a single food truck outside a Portland College campus to 17 bustling coffee shops across 3 states. He wasn't a corporate guy. He started with burnt fingers, long nights, and a deep love for coffee and community. But somewhere along the way, things got too big, too fast. Meetings replaced bar shifts, reports replaced real conversations. And lately, something had felt off. He'd been getting vague complaints, not about the product, people still loved the drinks, but about the vibe, the staff. Cold service, one email read. Felt like a nuisance asking for oat milk, said another, and one that stuck with him. Your coffee's great, but your people don't seem happy. He brought it up with his district managers. They brushed it off. One-off situations, they said. No major red flags. But Harlan had learned to trust his gut, and his gut said someone wasn't telling the whole story, so he decided to see for himself. He picked the shop in Tacoma, Washington, store number 9. It wasn't the worst performing, but it had the most turnover. And it was far enough from headquarters that no one would recognize him. None of the baristas had ever met him. Only the store manager, Mia, had once attended a corporate meet and greet 2 years ago, and Harlan looked different back then, clean-shaven suits and short hair. Now. He wore a thick hoodie, jeans, a beanie, and had grown a beard long enough to hide his jawline. He looked like a tired dad on his day off. He walked in right after the lunch rush. The shop was half full, students on laptops, a couple of moms with strollers, and a man snoring in the corner. The barista at the register didn't look up. You ordering or standing there for fun? She asked flatly. Harlan blinked. Iced caramel cold brew medium, the girl sighed. We call it grand, he nodded slowly. Right, grand. She punched it in and stepped aside. Name? Henry, he said. It was his middle name. Easy to remember. The other barista, a tall guy with a messy ponytail and sleepy eyes, slid him the drink without a word. Harlan thanked him anyway. He sat near the bar, sipping slowly, taking in the space. The music was too loud. The windows were smudged. The energy was low. He didn't expect smiles all day, but this felt drained. Then he overheard it. You know, Mia's not even here half the time, the girl from the register whispered to the guy at the bar. She's never here, he replied, rolling his eyes. She comes in, clocks in, leaves. I swear she takes tips too. Harlan's grip tightened on the cup. You serious, dude? I counted it last week. There was $30 less after her shift. No way that many people paid with card all night. She said I couldn't get promoted because of my hair, the guy muttered. Said it wasn't clean, looking for a lead. Like, what does that even mean? Harlan's throat went dry. The girl nodded, lowering her voice. She told me not to apply for assistant manager. Said I didn't have the right look for it. Then gave it to her friend from another store. They both laughed bitterly. Harlan stood up with his half-empty drink, walked past the register again, and dropped it in the trash. The girl barely glanced at him. The guy was already wiping a counter, humming under his breath. He stepped outside, heart pounding. This wasn't just a bad mood. This was a culture problem. This was a manager using her power to play favorites, to judge people by how they look. And maybe even stealing. For 5 minutes he sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, unsure if he was overreacting. Then he pulled out his phone and called his assistant. Don't tell anyone it's me, he said. But I'm going back to that store tomorrow. I want a full list of shifts. I want to know who's working, and I need an excuse to stay close for a few hours without raising eyebrows. The next morning, he came back as a mystery shopper. Corporate sometimes sent people to observe. The district manager had no clue it was him. They'd only emailed Mia to expect a feedback shopper sometime this week. Harlan walked in with a clipboard and a different hoodie. The same 2 baristas were working again. Hey, he said, approaching them slowly. Mind if I sit near the bar? I'm just here to observe for quality. Corporate, the guy asked. Yeah, just here to take notes. You won't even notice me. The girl rolled her eyes. Great. Over the next hour, he watched everything. They worked hard. The guy whose name tag said Zeke was cleaning constantly, fixing drink labels, double-checking orders. The girl Brinley was sharp, fast, good with customers when she actually looked up. But they were tense. on edge, and when a customer asked about a job posting, Brinley laughed. "You'd have to be friends with Mia to get hired. That's how it works here," Zeke added, "unless you look like you walked out of a catalog." Harlan scribbled fake notes, then asked, "Mind if I ask you two a question?" They looked at him warily. "If you could change one thing about this place, what would it be?" They hesitated, then Brinley shrugged. "A manager who shows up." Zeke glanced around. "And doesn't treat us like garbage." Harlan leaned in. "Anything else?" Zeke glanced at Brinley. For a moment they both looked unsure. "Look," Brinley said, lowering her voice. "I don't know who you are, but Mia told Zeke he'd never get promoted unless he cut his hair. She called him messy. It's not about skill here, it's about looks." Harlan felt something in his gut twist. Zeke added, "She told me customers don't want to be served by someone who looks unprofessional, but I've been here for over a year. I train new hires. I do inventory. I've never been late." "She told me I wasn't polished enough for management," Brinley added. "Like, what does that even mean?" "I've been running open shifts alone because she doesn't show up." They didn't know they were talking to the man who built the company from the ground up with calloused hands and black coffee, but Harlan heard every word, and tomorrow he was coming back again, not as Henry, as himself. Harlan Vance walked through the glass door just past 8 the next morning, wearing a crisp charcoal button-down and dark jeans. His beard was neatly trimmed now and the beanie was gone. No clipboard, no hoodie, no disguise. He looked like someone important because he was. The store was quiet. Only one customer sat near the window, sipping a latte and scrolling through a laptop. Zeke was setting out pastries, focused, meticulous. Brinley was behind the register, tapping something into the screen. She looked up, then did a double take. Zeke turned around, his body stiffened. Brinley's eyebrows pulled together. "You're..." Harlan walked slowly toward the counter. Morning, neither of them said anything. He waited for recognition to settle. "I think I've seen your photo on the company site," Zeke said finally, voice low. "You're Harlan." Harlan nodded. "That's right." Brinley folded her arms. "So yesterday, you were pretending." "I was listening," he said, "because I had too many people telling me things were fine and I didn't believe them." Brinley's jaw tensed. Zeke stepped back from the pastry case, unsure whether to speak. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," Harlan continued. "I came because I needed the truth, and you two gave it to me without realizing it." Brinley didn't say anything. Zeke glanced toward the back hallway. "Mia's not here yet, I know," Harlan said. "She's scheduled for 7:30. "She hasn't clocked in." Brinley shifted her weight. "She won't be in until noon, if she comes at all." Harlan nodded once and walked to the nearest table. "I'll wait." He stayed there for almost an hour, watching the flow of customers trickle in. Zeke kept the drink station clean and stocked without a word. Brinley handled the register quietly, only speaking to take orders and confirm names. Neither of them asked questions. They didn't need to. They were waiting too. At 9:15, a woman in aviator sunglasses and a beige trench coat walked in, holding a smoothie from another chain and talking into her phone. She didn't glance toward the counter. She didn't see Harlan. "Mia," he said, standing. She froze mid-step, then slowly turned her head. He took a step forward. "You and I need to talk, now." She lowered the phone from her ear, eyes narrowing. "I'm sorry who I'm Harlan Vance," he said calmly. "Founder, owner, the man who signs your paychecks." Mia's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He pointed toward the hallway leading to the back office. "Let's go." She walked ahead of him without speaking. Her posture had changed, shoulders tighter, stride slower. She wasn't in charge anymore, and she knew it. The small office in the back was cluttered with papers, half-empty water bottles, and a purse spilling over the desk. Harlan closed the door behind them. He didn't sit, neither did she. "You've been leaving during your shifts," he said. "Clocking in, disappearing for hours." "That true?" Mia blinked. "I sometimes step out for meetings or errands, manager duties." "Errands," Harlan repeated. "Like grabbing smoothies from competitors." She crossed her arms. "I'm entitled to breaks." "I trust my staff." "You also told one of them they'd never be promoted unless they cut their hair." He looked sloppy. "Customers make judgments. That's reality." "You also told another she wasn't polished enough for leadership." "Do you have a policy that defines what polished means?" Mia hesitated. "I use my judgment. Some people aren't management material, based on how they look," her lips pressed together. I use my experience. He studied her for a moment. Did you take tip money last week? Her face tightened. Excuse me. $30 went missing. You were the only person on shift both before and after. I don't touch tips, she said quickly. I don't even count them. Then why did Brinley say you pulled the jar into the office twice during closing? She's lying to protect herself. She's had attitude since day one. Harlan's voice stayed even. You're deflecting. I've managed this store for 2 years, Mia snapped. I've dealt with theft, broken equipment, no shows. You think I'm the problem because 2 kids whined to you for 5 minutes. I think you're the problem because you've created a culture where people stop caring. You think you know this store because you sat here pretending for a day. I know what it looks like when people give up. I started this company from scratch. I've worked through blizzards in a cart with no heat. I've had days where customers screamed at me from the window, and I still smiled because I believed in what I was building. Mia turned toward the door. If you want me gone, just say it. I wanted you accountable, he said. But now I want you gone. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She just walked out of the office without another word. Harlan waited until he heard the front door close, then he stepped out into the main room. Brinley and Zeke stood near the counter watching him. She left, he said. She won't be back. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Does that mean we're getting a new manager? Brinley asked. You are, Harlan said, but not from outside, not unless we need to. Zeke looked up. You're promoting someone, Harlan nodded, but not today. First, I need to understand this team, what you've been through, what needs fixing. Brinley raised her hands slowly. I've got a list. Harlan gave a tired smile. I figured. He turned toward the back. I'll be around the rest of the day. You two run the floor. I'll be in the office cleaning up that disaster she left behind. They returned to their duties without hesitation. By early afternoon, Harlan had gone through the last 3 weeks of shift logs, tip reports, and supply orders. There were gaps everywhere, missing receipts, overlapping time entries, and a handful of vendor invoices that had been paid twice. He pulled out his phone and called the finance director. Pull everything from store 9 for the last 6 months, he said. Cross-check with vendor payments and time cards. I want a full audit. He hung up and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't just about one bad manager. This was about oversight, systems that let someone slip through cracks long enough to poison a team. He had built a company on trust, but he'd stepped too far away from the ground floor. Late in the afternoon, he stepped out of the office to find Zeke restocking napkins. Want to grab a table? Harlan asked. Zeke looked surprised but nodded. They sat near the window, away from the counter. Harlan folded his hands. Tell me what I'm not seeing. Zeke looked out the window for a moment. People stopped caring here because they felt invisible. It wasn't just Mia. We'd ask for more training, nothing. Equipment broke, we'd wait weeks. You could work a double and no one noticed. You could show up late and nothing happened either. So no accountability, no recognition, Zeke nodded. It was like the place ran on autopilot and we were just placeholders. Harlan leaned forward. What would it take to change that? Someone who shows up, who listens, who backs us when things go wrong. Harlan took a breath. I can't be in every store, but I can make sure the people who have earned the right to lead. Zeke looked down at the table. I never wanted to be in charge. I just didn't want to feel like I was wasting my time. You're not, Harlan said. Starting now, you're not. Zeke didn't respond, but his shoulders eased. Harlan stood. Let's finish this day strong. Tomorrow we rebuild. The next morning, Harlan arrived at the Tacoma store before sunrise. The street was still wet from an early drizzle, and the sky was just starting to tint pale blue. He unlocked the front door with a master key, turned on the lights, and stood in the middle of the quiet floor. No music, no customers, just the sound of the espresso machine warming up. He rolled up his sleeves and went to work. By the time Brinley arrived, the pastry case was cleaned out and reset, the milk fridge was stocked with fresh cartons, and the supply closet had been reorganized. She paused at the entrance, eyes darting over the room. You do all this? She asked cautiously. I figured it was overdue, he said without looking up from the POS tablet he was updating. She stepped behind the counter, setting her bag down. You always open stores when you visit. I don't visit often enough. That's part of the problem. He glanced at her. She was tying on her apron, face unreadable but alert. She didn't ask questions this time. Just started pulling shots. An hour later, Zeke walked in, nodded once, and got to work on the prep list Harlan had taped to the back wall. At 10, a temporary manager from the Seattle region arrived. Her name was Ray. She was older, calm, and had been with the company since its earliest expansion. Harlan had called her the night before and explained everything. She hadn't asked for details, just told him she'd be there by mid-morning and to have a clean clipboard ready. By late afternoon, Ray had already held one-on-one check-ins with every employee scheduled that week. Harlan sat in the back office, reading through the notes she'd taken by hand. Ray's handwriting was sharp, no nonsense. She'd written down exact quotes, not summaries. One line stood out from Zeke's, "Not sure what loyalty gets you here besides more shifts." Another from Brinley, "I don't want a promotion if it means becoming someone like Mia." Harlan set the notes down and pressed his fingers against his forehead. He hadn't just missed bad behavior. He'd let the entire middle layer of leadership drift into survival mode. No one was growing. They were just surviving each week. Ray knocked on the frame of the open office door. "You've got a minute?" she asked. He nodded. She closed the door behind her and sat across from him. "This crew's beat down but not broken, I figured. They're more competent than they realize, but they've never seen what good leadership actually looks like. They've only seen control. Think they'll stay, some will, if they believe you mean to fix it." He leaned back in the chair. "If you were me, where would you start?" She didn't hesitate. "Accountability at the district level." Harlan nodded slowly. "I already pulled the last 6 months of shift audits. There's a pattern, not just here." Ray crossed one leg over the other. "Then this isn't a store problem. It's a system problem." "I know." They sat in silence for a few seconds. "I'll hold the fort here for the next 2 weeks, Ray said. "But you need to get ahead of this. Quiet fixes won't rebuild trust." Harlan stood. "They shouldn't be quiet." "I'll schedule a company-wide town hall." She reached for the doorknob. "Start with the people who have been showing up without being seen." That night, Harlan didn't go home. He stayed after close, sitting at a corner table with a legal pad and pen, writing out a list of names. Not executives. Not regional directors. Just people he'd met in the last 2 days who were still trying, still putting effort into a company that had stopped recognizing them. Zeke. Brinley. A part-time closer named Lewis, who'd covered 2 no-show shifts last week without complaint. A shift lead named Tara, who'd managed to keep inventory under budget every month, despite delivery delays and missing supervisors. He wrote down every name he could remember from Ray's notes. Then he circled 4 of them. The next morning, he arrived just before open and asked Zeke to sit with him before the first rush. They took the table near the window again. The cafe was still empty. "I've got a question," Harlan said, "and I mean this seriously. What would it take for you to consider stepping into a leadership role here?" Zeke didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, chewing his bottom lip. "I don't want to be a boss," he said eventually. "Neither did I," Harlan said. "But someone had to decide what mattered." Zeke turned back to him. "I don't want to be the one who has to tell people they're not good enough." "Then don't. Be the one who helps them get better." Zeke looked down at the table. "You really think I could do that?" "I think you already are. You stayed, you trained people, you showed up even when no one was watching." Zeke exhaled slowly. "I'd want to do it my way," Harlan nodded. "That's the only way it'll work." Zeke didn't say anything more, but when he stood, he didn't walk away. He went straight to the back and started prepping for open like it was any other shift, but Harlan noticed the difference. His movements had weight now. Purpose. Later that day, Harlan called Brinley to the office. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, but her posture was less guarded than before. "I read Ray's notes," Harlan said. She raised an eyebrow. "All of them? Every word?" "Then you know I said I didn't want to be a manager," he nodded. "I'm not offering you a title. Good. But I am offering you a voice. We're building a peer feedback group, something outside of the traditional hierarchy. I want your input on hiring, training, and how we define leadership." She narrowed her eyes. "Why me?" "Because you're not afraid to tell the truth, and because I need people who have been ignored to help rebuild what we lost." Brinley didn't move for a few seconds. Then she stepped into the office and closed the door behind her. What's the catch? You'll have to meet with people you don't trust. Give them feedback. Be patient while we clean up years of bad habits. She shook her head. I'm not patient, neither am I. That's why I need you. She sat down across from him. You're serious about this? I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. She leaned back in the chair. All right, but if this turns into some corporate PR stunt, I walk. Fair deal. By the end of the week, Harlan had visited 3 more stores. He didn't go undercover again. He didn't need to. People had started talking. Word was spreading that he'd shown up, fired a manager, and stayed to fix what was broken, not delegate it. Fix it. Some were skeptical, others cautious. A few hopeful, but the shift had begun. And as he sat on the late-night train back to Portland that Friday, Harlan looked out the window, watching the blur of lights pass by, and thought about the weight of rebuilding something you thought you already built. He didn't need to be a hero. He just needed to keep showing up. 2 weeks later, the Tacoma store felt like a different place. The music played at a gentler volume, just enough to fill the room without drowning out conversation. The windows were clean, the menu boards updated, and the tip jar, now kept in full view at all times, was nearly full by noon. No one had made a big speech. No banners, no slogans. Just small, deliberate changes that had started to add up. On a clear Tuesday morning, Harlan returned to the store without a clipboard, without an agenda. He didn't wear a hoodie or a company polo. Just jeans and a navy jacket, the same kind he used to wear running the old coffee truck near campus in the early days. Zeke was already behind the bar, sleeves rolled up, writing something on the prep whiteboard. He nodded once when he saw Harlan but didn't pause what he was doing. Brinley was restocking lids at the condiment station, focused and quick. Ray was seated near the back, typing into a tablet, her glasses pushed low on her nose. Harlan walked to the counter. No one rushed over. No one froze. They just kept working. He waited until the lull between customers before speaking. I want to meet with the team, he said. 15 minutes, after the morning rush. Zeke glanced at the line, then gave a small nod. We'll make it work. At 11:30, Ray flipped the back in 10 minutes sign and locked the front door. The customers inside were offered free refills and thanked for their patience. No grumbling, no complaints. Everyone gathered around the largest table in the center of the room. Zeke leaned forward with his forearms on the table. Brinley sat cross-legged in her chair, arms loose at her sides. Lewis, Tara, and a newer hire named Sam filled out the rest of the circle. Ray stood off to the side, hands clasped behind her back. Harlan took a seat and looked at each of them. I've spent the last 10 days visiting stores, he said. Most of them are running, but very few are thriving, and that's on me. No one jumped to reassure him. They just listened. I thought systems would protect the culture, that structure would carry the mission forward. But it turns out culture doesn't scale, people do. And when we stop listening to the people, the mission dies quietly. Lewis rubbed the back of his neck. Sam shifted in his seat. I have a plan, Harlan continued, but I'm not here to present it, I'm here to test it, against reality. Against you? Brinley tilted her head. You want us to fix the company? I want you to test what we're building before we hand it to anyone else. This store is the pilot location for the new structure. Zeke sat back slowly. What does that involve? 2 things. First, autonomy. You'll run the store without a traditional manager. Scheduling, training, inventory handled by a rotating lead team of 3. You'll decide who those 3 are. Roles rotate every 3 months. No one leads forever. Tara frowned slightly. And accountability. Ray stays on as your regional support, but she doesn't run the store. You answer to each other, and you answer to the customers. Sam scratched his chin. What about raises, hiring? You'll have a budget and a hiring slot. You'll make the decisions. I'll review them quarterly with Ray, but I won't interfere unless something's off. Brinley looked across the table. Second thing, ownership, Harlan said. Starting next quarter, this store gets a revenue-sharing model. A percentage of net profit is pooled and distributed among you. It's not a bonus, it's a stake. If you cut waste, you keep more. If sales rise, you gain more, Lewis blinked. Even part-timers, especially part-timers. Everyone here contributes, everyone earns. For a few moments, no one said anything. Harlan let the silence stretch. Then Zeke asked, what happens if we fail? You'll know before I do, and then you'll fix it. Brinley leaned forward. And what happens if it works? Then we roll it out to 5 more stores. Tara folded her arms, and if it fails at those, then we pull back, we adapt. But we don't go back to the old way. Ray stepped forward slightly. You all have the grit. What you need now is clarity. This plan gives you both. Harlan looked at each of them again. You don't have to agree today. You can talk it over, sleep on it, but if you're in, I need full buy-in. No halfway. Brinley looked at Zeke, then at Tara. I'm in, Lewis nodded. Me too, Zeke gave a small but certain nod. Let's do it. Ray unlocked the door. The line outside had grown. A few customers waved when they saw the lights come back on. The team went back behind the counter without fanfare. No one celebrated. They just picked up where they left off, but something had shifted. The way they moved, the way they spoke to each other, it all carried a quiet confidence. Over the next 4 weeks, Harlan kept his distance. He received updates through Ray, reviewed numbers once a week, and watched from afar as the Tacoma store ran more efficiently than it had in over a year. Employee turnover dropped to 0. Sales nudged upward. Customer satisfaction surveys, which had been mostly ignored before, were now filled with glowing comments and several handwritten notes complimenting specific baristas by name. One evening, Ray called him from her car. They're training 2 new hires, she said. And they created their own onboarding checklist, even added a section on how to handle regulars with mobility issues. Harlan closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. They've also started a weekly meeting, Ray continued. No one told them to. They just meet for 30 minutes before opening every Friday. They set goals, review what went wrong. It's working. 3 months later, Harlan returned to Tacoma for a check-in. He didn't schedule it. He didn't announce it. He just walked in during a Friday evening shift. The store was packed. Zeke was behind the bar, directing drink flow without a word. Brinley handed off orders at the handoff station, calling out names with ease. Tara was taking orders, her tone warm and conversational. Even Sam, who'd once looked like he wanted to disappear behind the counter, moved with certainty. Harlan waited until the line thinned before approaching the counter. Zeke didn't blink. You just here for coffee, just here to watch. Brinley passed him a drink. We made you something, no charge. Harlan took the cup, then stepped to the side and watched the team work. No one needed prompting. No one looked over their shoulder. The energy was steady, unforced. He took a sip. The drink was strong, smooth, exactly right. He stepped outside and sat on the bench near the front window, watching the street lamps flicker on. The company wasn't perfect. There were more stores to visit, more conversations to have, more broken processes to fix. But this one was working, and not because of a policy, because people had been trusted to lead. As the evening crowd poured in, Harlan stood, tipped his drink toward the window in silent thanks, and walked down the sidewalk, leaving the shop behind him refreshed, alive, and in good hands.